the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is outcast, the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we get started with today's discussion on Baudrillard's Symbolic Exchange in Death, Chapter 3, which is about fashion or the enchanting spectacle of the code, drop us $1 a month at www.patreon.com/MUHH. If you can't drop $1 a month, then send us a
review on iTunes, because some asshole gave us like a 1 star or like a 3 star the other day. For the longest time, it was at 5, and now we're at 4.8 or some shit because of 2 assholes. So the first 2 editions of the Symbolic Exchange conversations we've had, Symbolic Exchange of Death, I should say, you've said that you've found it frustrating. This time around, the third time has been the charm, it seems. Maybe we could have you start out with talking about why that is, or...
I think I'm embracing the frustration. You know what I mean? Like I'm embracing the fact that this is new material for me. This is quote unquote the mature Baudrillard. Or doesn't he say somewhere that this is like one of the last real books he wrote, or that was appreciated, or some shit?
Huh? No, I hadn't.
Have we talked? I thought we had. In any case, after this, 5 years later in 81, he writes Simulacra and Simulation, or Simulation and Simulacra, and that's the book he's like best known for. And a lot of the other books he writes are very short. So this is like one of his mature elaborations. And I say mature not in a sense of like an old sense, but in the sense of which, like, he's trying to develop this thesis. Yeah. And I don't really know what it is yet, but except for like the terrorism of the code and shit like that, right?
Which I think is going to be a big focus. Honestly, today it's almost, fashion and the code that's the predominant mode of the conversation today, aside from a few deviations here and there.
The thesis developing about the code, which we've talked about a little bit, but which I still think maybe he assumes we understand what he means by that. And the way that I try to think about the code as he's using it is what he points to in the very first pages, I think, of chapter 1, when he turns to Saussure and says, linguistics, or semiology, as Bart calls it, right, begins to focus.
Well, semiotics or semiology?
Semiology is what Bart calls it. Remember,
that's what Guattari said, use semiology, and Bart semiotics.
Mm-mm.
No,
Charles Sanders Peirce develops what he calls semiotics, and Guattari says, well, I'm going to make the same kind of arbitrary distinction that Bart does when he calls the science of signs semiology. For Guattari, semiology is on one side focused mainly on linguistic sign systems.
Okay.
And for Guattari, semiotics would be interested in the intensive asignifying, right?
Gotcha.
Right. Anyway, it's like Baudrillard's, I guess, code is code word for when values are hyper-focused on the play of signifiers amongst themselves, right? The distinctive oppositions of signs. Signs don't mean anything by themselves, in and of themselves, only in opposition or distinction from other signs or other signifiers, really. And also you see him in this chapter, he's kind of thinking back to a lot of his argument in The Mirror of Production. The Mirror of Production starts with this kind of polemics against a fixation or fetishizing of production at the expense of, say, consumption, which is something that I think Baudrillard tries to bring more into relief.
Right.
For example, he has a little polemics against Deleuze for fetishizing production of the unconscious, which I think I don't think Baudrillard cares to like develop that thesis. I think he just, it's obvious that Baudrillard doesn't give a shit about the fact that there are three syntheses and consumption is one of them. But you can see some of this in Marx. And I think his reading of Marx in that book is interesting. And so I feel like the more I read of the early Baudrillard, the less frustrated I get. The more I'm able to sit with my frustration and feel that it is useful. This is new stuff. And I think that if you're reading something new and you're not having some feeling of uncomfortableness or some feeling of that unsettles you from your complacency, then is anything new happening? I still think Baudrillard needs a hug and like a blunt and a fruit cup. But because there are moments in this chapter specifically where I'm like, all right, how is this not just pure fucking nihilism? Right. And I think that's the thing. Baudrillard is confronting us with a certain form of nihilism. The interplay is where it's like, okay, is this coming from you, or is this what you're saying modern culture, confronts us with? Right. And I think that's where Baudrillard's almost like hyper cynicism, yes, if you will, is probably what I'm wrestling with. Yeah. I think that's fair. I think that's pretty fair. It is interesting, I guess, this relative to the code. It's almost like the reverse of decoded flows. Like it's the reverse operation, right? In terms of the way the capitalist overcoding that Baudrillard discusses, the binary code of the flattening out of everything in a general equivalence. You're right that for Deleuze and Guattari, capitalism sort of unleashes decoded flows, whereas for Baudrillard, he almost wants to. It's not even saying the opposite, because they're not using, when they say code, they're not even using the same. It's not a binary code, right? They're not even using the same conceptualizations. But, for Baudrillard, capitalism is like the predominance of the code. Exactly. If you remember the text I sent you, where I said, one of the things that I find interesting about Baudrillard is he wants to say positive conceptualizations of primitive cultures from our standpoint is like an ethnocentric rewriting, and like we're only gazing like narcissistically in a mirror of ourselves and projecting it onto primitive cultures. And yet he takes from primitive cultures this difference and imposes the lack that we have onto modern culture. So it's like an asymmetrical move, where primitive cultures can't be, obviously you don't want to be like a dumb Rousseauian and just be noble savage, right? I mean, obviously that there's something problematic in that, but then to like look at modern culture or modern men as ignoble savages or something in light of primitive cultures. You see what I mean? Like you can't sugarcoat primitive cultures, but you can talk shit about your own culture, and that's not ethnocentric, right? That's one of the problems that I have sometimes reading Baudrillard, is that cynicism that I was talking about, right? It's kind of like judging life, as Nietzsche says in Twilight of the Idols. You can't be judge and jury and executioner and executed at the same time. You can't judge life from within life. Obviously, you can't judge it outside of life either, because for other reasons. But you're living. See. Yeah. You live in society. You live in society. We're on overcoding. Fashion is only a simulation of the innocence of becoming. That's a direct quote, right? Yeah, that's a direct quote. I just thought that was an interesting quote. A simulation of the innocence of becoming. And this is a Nietzschean concept, this notion of this struggle with the fact of becoming's innocence, right? Because this is why the transvaluation of all values is so important in Nietzsche, because, with, say like an ancient philosopher like Plato, becoming is always on the negative side of the binary, right? Being and becoming. Being is always what's good, what's highest. It's what's real. Becoming is like an accident, to use Aristotle's term. And so the problem for Nietzsche is the fact that becoming drags all of being along with it. And this is why affirming the eternal return means affirming the whole, thereby restoring innocence to becoming. Looking at this little quote, because it's getting at, I couldn't remember if he said transvaluation or it's transmutation. So I was looking at this little quote to try to see if there was I couldn't remember if he'd used transmutation or transvaluation here relative to the binary logic of modernity. This is a good quote because it gets to some of what he means by code, right? So we should read this.
For binary logic is the essence of modernity, and it impels infinite differentiation and the dialectical effects of rupture. Modernity is not transmutation, but the commutation of all values, their combination and their ambiguity. Modernity is a code, and fashion is its emblem.
You looked up commutation. The only reason why I even know the word is, I think, because of its use in symbolic logic and mathematics.
Yes.
Well, okay, it is also a juridical term. You can commute a sentence, but that's not what he's talking about. That's a different meaning.
Now, looking at Merriam-Webster, I was thinking the second definition, replacement, specifically a substitution of one form of payment or charge for another. I was thinking perhaps that was what the usage he was referring to here. And their example is a commutation by money payment for the exacted service. That seems to be the only one, other than the first one being relative to exchange and trade.
It's a logic of substitution rather than a logic of transformation.
The act of substituting one thing for another, substitution, exchange.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Not the transmutation. Okay, so what is transmute? Change.
Yeah, it's the word mutate is change. Obviously, transmutation would be a much more radical form of change than commutation. You know, I mean, I think that word commutation is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this notion of code as a question of substituting values almost in an indefinite indifference rather than, again, this is very Nietzschean, this question of the transmutation, the transvaluation of all values. That assumes a kind of activity, whereas Baudrillard, with the hypercynicism that I was talking about, you know, commutation would be kind of indifferent to the evaluator. Right, to the Ubermensch who transvalues. It's interesting, right? I mean, like, you know, a Nietzschean eternal return where you affirm the differences in the extremes versus maybe a Baudrillardian eternal return where affirmation doesn't even come into question.
Right.
You know, it's indifferent to you, kind of like the real, right?
Yeah.
In terms of Lacan or Laruelle, it's foreclosed to thought. What I like about this notion of fashion is, and you have this in one of your bullet points, is this distinction of fashion and dress.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, in a normal everyday sense, fashion has that connotation of merely meaning
what does one wear?
What one wears. Whereas, you know, like in Nietzsche's, sometimes it's translated untimely meditations, sometimes it's translated as unfashionable observations. And it's this question of the timeliness, the fashion, or as Baudrillard points out, literally the mode, right? I mean, that's all modernity means is it is the mode, right? It is quote unquote in fashion. I forget who he quotes, but he quotes somebody, maybe it's not someone I recognize, but there was an awesome quote about the fashion of thought, particularly philosophies, and how one assumes the words and the verbal play, but not the line of inquiry. Maybe the word is inquiry and he says some stuff here about psychoanalysis, nor does psychoanalysis avoid the fate of fashion, right? So whether it's in vogue to be Lacanian or Jungian or Freudian or Reichian, right? I mean,
right.
These trends. And so the unconscious returns to its old habits as it is generally required to do, and psychoanalysis takes on social force just as the code does, and is followed by an extraordinary complexification of theories of the unconscious, all commutable and basically indifferent. I don't really agree with that, in my opinion. I think that but it's actually the next page that's important. I was just going to say, I think that certain complexes, certain even like vibes. Me, I don't think I would vibe with a Jungian analyst. I have a father-in-law who's a Jungian analyst. I already know that I wouldn't vibe with him, but I just think certain people would. Certain people would vibe with the Jungian type. Certain people would need an analyst who has like a tough love transference, right? I don't know if that can all be rendered indifferent. I think that's important, right? To like the Wolfman, you know, he went to Freud and got some stuff out of Freud, and it was later in his life that Freud's student, you know, perhaps he needed a female analyst, and some new shit came to light through that. Within language, the element subject of fashion is not the signification of discourse but its mimetic support, that is, its rhythm, its tonality, its articulation, and gesture. This is equally true of intellectual fashions, existentialism or structuralism. It is the vocabulary and not the inquiry that is taken on. Again, that's a highly cynical approach, but that quote kind of crystallizes what people mean when they either describe themselves or others as pseuds, right? As pseudo-intellectuals.
Yeah, taking on the signs.
That's the question, right? When we talk about, I think it's interesting where it's not even just he almost contradicts himself, because it's not even the vocabulary itself that's the problem. It's the mode of exposition of the vocabulary, right? It's that mode of mimicking a style. And, this is the question about,
I only pretend to mimic. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, yeah,
I'm being a smart ass there.
No, I mean, it's.
I'm just drawing on that Derrida quote that I just love about to do the thing. I pretend not to do the thing, or to do the thing, or some shit.
Or it's like the over attentive waiter in Being a Nothingness, right? I mean, like, you can't be the waiter. You can only pretend to be the waiter.
I wish I knew more about Leibniz and his God that he referred to, and we discussed a little bit in the
binary God.
The second chapter.
Yeah,
because I feel like
God.
That might help with this binary code, because I'm still not exactly on board with what he means, other than maybe this move to flatten out everything into the code of either on or off. And maybe that has something to do with death as well, right? Because death is a binary logic because that's the whole structure of the binary code is electrical charge or no.
Yes.
If you're getting down to the level of the transistor, at the end of the day, things are getting translated into that binary.
And this is Lacan too, when he talks about the symbolic, right? He's open, closed, like you were saying. It's positive, negative.
Yeah.
It's the binary. Yeah. I mean, Leibniz's book on, I think it's called Theodicy.
Didn't Leibniz fucking, he was involved with calculus, right, as well? Isn't it a question of like even who invented calculus, or like there's some dispute?
He independently invented calculus.
Gotcha.
He and Newton. And Deleuze goes into this in chapter 4 of Difference of Repetition, which is one of the most difficult chapters, but also amazingly beautiful. He reinvestigates the history of the philosophy of mathematics, not all of it, but it's based on the question of the differential and the infinitesimal. And basically, Deleuze says that mathematicians ignored the infinitesimal, or the problem of it, by trying to say, well, it's the infinitesimal, so it's like infinitely approaching zero, so we can just say it's zero. And Deleuze is like, no,
right,
you're fucking up difference, right? I mean, so
nice, kind of like Zeno's paradox, almost, right?
Yeah, that's involved.
Or at least the logic of it,
right?
Sort of as you approach the wall, it can,
if I'm
virtually zero.
Look it up.
Not really.
Yeah, right. You can never reach the limit
if you keep halving the distance, etc.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that Deleuze does with Leibniz in Difference of Repetition is he opposes Leibniz's investigation of the infinitely small, versus Hegel's meditations on the infinitely large, right? The bad infinite and the good infinite, as Badiou himself talks about. Simondon, for the same reason, opposes or juxtaposes Spinoza and Leibniz, because for Simondon, Spinoza, kind of like the Stoics, there's only one individual, and it's substance, God, right? For Leibniz, everything's individual. So Simondon's like, neither of these works to think the individual. You fuck up the individual by making it either like the sum of all beings or the sum of all things, or you make everything individual. Like, you can't think like these are the two extremes. Mm-hmm. And there has to be like a way to navigate between them. Yeah. And it's kind of the opposition between the Stoics and the Epicureans, right? For the Stoics, you have this like great primal seminal fire, the cosmos, from which all things emanate. And for the Epicureans, atoms is where it's all happening. And the Kleineman, for Simondon, this is kind of why Marx wrote his dissertation on the Epicureans. There's a whole materialism there that's interesting, that needs to be held on to, but that has to be kind of further enlightened with scientific investigation. Anyway, we were talking about fucking Baudrillard and the code. With the binary logic stuff, it makes sense that Leibniz would be referenced, right? Because he's a mathematical genius, And the simplest kind of mathematical system is obviously a binary logic
system. Yeah.
We see what computers, for example, can do. They manipulate zeros and ones. We see what they're capable of. We see what they're capable of literally simulating, right? So maybe the code's not so bad. I know the steak that I'm eating, right,
I know the Matrix is telling my brain the steak I'm eating is delicious. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, sometimes you want to.
But I don't care. Yeah, but I don't care.
Right.
Now, something that's interesting here too that we can maybe pick up on and take a departure, but that still wrestles with something similar is he talks about modernity here. Now, one of the principal aspects of modernity that he discusses is going to be that what modernity does is sets up cycles of production via.
Yes.
And I guess the implication being through formalizing time zones, etc., as part of a way to organize production, supply chains, etc. Effectively, all the things that undergird the global economy relative to time and so forth. Because there has to be a general equivalency of time. Time is the fundamental general equivalency, I suppose, that has to be instantiated first, because effectively what is happening is the extraction of surplus time. What gets sort of interesting is there are these cycles of production. Okay, then also you see this cyclical nature of fashion as well that follows this almost a death drive that has its sort of own death drive, because there is a spring, a fall fashion line, for example, and things come back into fashion. That's not the most astute point, right, that we haven't heard a million times or like you haven't observed in the world, but there is something interesting, I think, relative to eternal recurrence and eternal recurrence, desire, and fashion relative to the repetition of a slightly different, right? Because even the fashion trends that get recycled or recur are not, it's not exactly the same. There's a modification, right? Suits may resemble an older, or like, I'm trying to think of a good example of where this would fit, but you have to get so deep into the aesthetics of something.
Well, I mean,
you may not be able to communicate it very well verbally.
I think you're doing great. I mean, you set up a lot of the big points that Baudrillard is talking about with the recurrence of cycles, the dead labor on which signification rests, the flotation of signs, and this way of exhibiting the retro and the
neo. Yeah, everything is
neo,
retro and neo concurrently.
I mean,
which I think you can see that in what's more relevant now, in particular, right? Especially the way that this process is intensified in the extreme relative to the era of mass communication.
You can see in the interplay between steampunk and cyberpunk, just ways of recycling the retro and the neo. This is interesting when Baudrillard brings up, he's quoting Vogue, I think. And
he does quote Vogue, yeah.
Which is kind of cool. He's quoting Vogue magazine. I assume maybe French Vogue, and we're not told, but he brings up haute couture, right? Which is obviously literally the highest form of fashion because everything's handmade, right? Not mass produced. And the whole flavor of the Vogue quote is kind of is about fashion flaunting the futility of utility. That futility is privileged above what Baudrillard considers to be a modern principle of utility, right? There's something about fashion's there's something about fashion's indifference towards usefulness, which is why it exemplifies the sort of indifferent flotation of signs. It exemplifies this principle of commutation in the code.
What I like about this idea here is how he ties it to potlatch, particularly haute couture as the ultimate expression.
Ultimate potlatch?
The ultimate example of potlatch relative to fashion. And like I mentioned earlier, there is the whole cyclical nature of the fashion show and the fashion industry between fall, winter. And now, that keeps on expanding to there's pre-winter and pre-summer and resort this proliferation of all these periodizations of release schedules for production that is really kind of tied to the older form of production whenever there was a more industrial society. Now we have presumably the technology where you could have a more on-demand style a production that's not so top down driven.
Mm-hmm. We were watching yesterday, and this is perfect. HBO has a new show called
Oh yeah. I haven't
Hype.
watched that yet.
I think it's called Hype.
Something like that, yeah.
And basically it's like a Project Runway type show, but it's for streetwear,
which I love.
And which is a kind of, which is what's nice is that it kind of exemplifies Baudrillard's, it crystallizes some of the stuff he says about graffiti, but streetwear is now kind of, at least exemplified in this show, it's avant-garde, it's haute couture, everything is handmade, everything is singular. But what's cool is at the same time, there are these sewing machines that can be programmed such that you make your singular streetwear design, but you program in all of the modifications and the stitching patterns, blah, 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 so that it can be mass produced. It's kind of this interesting tension or simultaneity of singular production and mass production, which is why someone like, when I was reading this chapter, I kept thinking of Walter Benjamin's essay on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, right? So much of Baudrillard's, I call it nostalgia, even if he rails against it, is seemingly this, I don't know if it's a lamentation or if it's just a confrontation with the fact that the aura, quote unquote, around singular works of art, whether it be clothes or paintings or whatever, fashion itself, the aura is gone. And one of the things that I saw in Hype for the streetwear is the fact that so many of these articles of clothing had writing, lots of slogans and phrases.
Like a maximalist aesthetic.
Yeah, one of them was like art is war, but some of them were like 20, 30 words, like fucking almost wall of text shit.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of, trying to remember his name, this famous Marxist historian, might be Thompson. Anyway, he talks about the birth of modernity is the death of Marat by David. And what he argues is, in the death of Marat, the painting, if you want, you can pull it up. It's kind of cool.
I think I know this painting.
You probably do. It's pretty famous. He's got a piece of writing on it. And to understand the painting, you're kind of forced to read, so to speak. Like the linguistic sign becomes predominant. And he considers this to be like this kind of indexical benchmark for the birth of modernity, as we call it. I saw that in the Hype after the first episode or two. Somebody first did it and like had a bunch of words, and then everyone else started doing it. They were like, "Oh, well, I see that the judges like this shit, so we're gonna have a lot of writing on it." So yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. I wonder what Baudrillard would do with that. I mean, I'm sure he would play with it, but it's this interesting thing where the linguistic sign becomes predominant in fashion, in dress. I think that's something we could call it, whether it's postmodern or whatever you want to label it. The legibility of dress is interesting.
Can you tease that out a little bit more?
Yeah. So I think that, with what Baudrillard is talking about, how we're not talking about any longer a drifting of signs in relation to one another. Like one might say, and I think the drifting of signs is kind of maybe an allusion to like Lacan talking about the slipping of the signifier across the bar.
Lacan or Derrida.
Yeah. And but the flotation, it's no longer anchored, right? The drifting is like a tectonic metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. There's almost
But the flotation, it's not even, there's no anchor of support. There's just like an abyss. And I see the legibility of the clothing, of the street clothing, in this kind of avant-garde way. Well, it's avant-garde and it's not, because, high fashion, you're not going to have, I mean, I could be wrong, but all the high fashion I've seen, that kind of writing would be considered gauche. Is that a good word for it? It would be considered like,
I mean,
like
I think
lowbrow, you know?
I think in the this trend of streetwear meeting luxury is something, honestly, that Kanye West is in particular, but not only, but largely Kanye is sort of responsible almost solely for this avant-garde streetwear that you're talking about. This is my aesthetic, effectively.
The streetwear meets luxury. I think that so much of the kind of the trend for the past 20, 30 years with like t-shirts, like Hot Topic popularized a lot of t-shirts with writing, just random quirky messages. Yeah. And I think that's what I was kind of seeing, that legibility of the t-shirt moving into other, as you said, this luxurious streetwear that along with it came the medium is the message shit, right? The message itself becomes preponderant over.
The content is irrelevant.
Or it becomes at least as elevated as the dress itself. And so I think that's something interesting. So it is kind of, to me, I see it as a kind of a counterattack against what Baudrillard is talking about with relation to the flotation of signs. I mean, like his whole point at the end of this chapter is about how power hates fashion because it calls into question power's own signs. And so I see the legibility of the luxurious streetwear, the writing as a way of anchoring signs or anchoring meaning, if you will, against the kind of abyss of meaning, that the meaninglessness that Baudrillard sees in fashion.
What about something like as banal as that's been talked about 1,000 times as the Che Guevara t-shirt as a counterpoint? I think to what you're saying, but I'm not sure.
The way I read that is, in terms of capitalism's axiomatic, as D&G say, right? In terms of its limit, whatever seemingly threatens capitalism can eventually or potentially be reinscribed within the limits of capitalism and marketed. Yeah. So, the complete works of Marx and Engels doesn't threaten capitalism. It can market that. The Che Guevara t-shirt, it can market that. And in some ways it knows that just by doing that, by its allowance, it also depotentializes that threat as it markets it for consumption. Huh. One of the things that I disagree with Baudrillard is this notion that in Marx, maybe in certain thinkers, maybe there is a trend to analyze production and productivity as active versus consumption as passive. But I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure if I see that throughout Marx. I'm thinking of like the introduction to the Grundrisse, even in Deleuze and Guattari, this notion that consumption is passive and production is active seems like a too easy of a binary. Yeah. I guess that's the thing with Baudrillard is sometimes I feel like...
Did Marx really get much into consumption? Well, I feel like he is picking on something, something that's occurring with modernity relative to, I mean, fashion is a great way to exemplify this because I think I even mentioned this last time. The development of the consumer culture was not something that I think Marx could have anticipated. Right?
No, not necessarily. No.
Only with full-on modernity. With Baudrillard says this too, is this is when fashion is sort of invented along with modernity. Yeah. This cyclical thing is invented and there's this sort of imagined beginning and end.
Yeah, and his main point being that once traditional hierarchies are disestablished or demolished, and once the differentiation of the classes is also kind of dismantled as well, that's when fashion comes into being. That's when fashion deterritorializes from dress or from costumery. We talked about this in chapter 2, I think, a little bit, right? Where he kind of anticipates this chapter. Yeah. With how in the, I'm not sure if he references Goethe or whatever, but like how in like, traditional folk tales or even the traditional novel, you play at being royalty, right? You dress up like a prince. That's not fashion, right? You're trying to deceive and you're able to deceive. Now, I don't know what the fuck you would do. I don't know how you would.
Well, you still see kind of this distinction because you often see this as a polemic consumerism. It's usually the pejorative of the millennial or the whomever that has an iPhone. You'll see all of these diagrams and it's like expensive hat, shirt, shoes, etc. And then they show the billionaire and the billionaire is wearing jeans and a t-shirt and that, a $50 shirt versus etc. Right. So there is a bit of which is kind of funny because it's
classism. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like, it's interesting, this division, because of, on the one hand, it's the waste, it's the potlatch element that draws that's kind of the logic behind this critique of the person that that's not wealthy buying the signs of wealth or the clothes or whatever to sort of seem as if they are, right? Taking on those signs.
The everyman.
Well, it's the reverse. So they're mirrored. So on one side you have oftentimes it's the billionaire that tries to look more like a person of the people sometimes.
Yes,
like Steve Jobs with the black turtleneck and jeans and like sneakers, right? So he's not wearing an expensive suit or anything like that. He's not wearing his Rolex, right? He is trying to have this sort of egalitarian style of dress, even though he was one of, the most wealthy people.
It's like the anti-flaunting of wealth. It's the only way to calling attention to itself, because like you said, he's trying to dress like the everyman. Also, Bill Gates, billionaire, has a $5 haircut, looks like a fucking schlub.
Yeah. So you see this pretty frequently, right? You see the billionaire, even like Zuckerberg, right? With I think at one time it was flip-flops and the North Face fleece, like whenever Facebook was first coming out. I don't know if that's so much the case anymore at this point, but at one time he did have the kind of distinctive like jeans and you know what I mean? That was kind of his de rigueur. So on the one side you have that, you know what I mean? There's a reaction to the potlatch, the wasteful element of fashion in the context of the hype beast or the fuck boy, or these are like terms for, right, the person who is trying to flash designer labels, right? There's a pejorative element to that. Not only, so there's a pejorative sense for those outside of that community that are judging them based on that binary that I gave of the billionaire and the fuck boy or the hype beast or whatever. So on one side you have that, on the other side you have the potlatch, and that brings a distinction. But then like the billionaire is also trying to do something different. You know what I mean? They're trying to mimic the signs of the everyday man. I don't know. There's a weird reflection there. And when they talk about old money as well, old money has the connotation of not having this conspicuous consumption element the way that quote unquote new money does.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's one of the key dynamics of a novel like The Great Gatsby, right? This ostentatious flaunting of wealth, throwing the lavish parties, and in many cases, not even enjoying them, right? Having that singular desire for Daisy, but he can never, with all of that ostentatiousness, he can never simulate old money.
Right.
He's always nouveau riche.
Yeah.
Right. It's always the East-West egg shit, which is a kind of question of territories and deterritorialization.
Right.
And in that sense, right. I mean, like, I think less today, I guess, increasingly, at least in America and perhaps in the West, you're seeing less and less of this question of the what's the word? I can't think of it, but the old and the new money, like you were saying, that binary is
eroding,
almost kind of passe, right? But perhaps in other cultures, you still see that. You probably still see that kind of thing. And it is a question of, as Baudrillard is saying, is a question of modernity, is a question of the acceleration of, the acceleration of development, progress in terms of markets, in terms of, money making, capital, all that shit. I like this quote again. I'm still looking at the Vogue quote. What is more anachronistic, more dream laden than a sailing ship? The fuck does that mean? Haute couture. It discourages the economist, takes up a stance contrary to productivity techniques. It is an affront to democratization. Based, I guess. As I was saying, now that's not so much true. If one's haute couture, one's singular productive techniques by hand can be replicated by these, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 machines, the interesting programming, the programmability of the sewing machine. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's part of the dominance of the code, right? And It's kind of like Picasso by paint by numbers, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I like this quote. It says, we would like to see a functional squandering everywhere so as to bring about symbolic destruction. I think that's a pretty cool quote.
But how do we do that? That's the question. Yeah.
It is hard to acknowledge that the law of value extends well beyond the economic and that its true task today is the jurisdiction of all models. Wherever there are models, there is an imposition of the law of value, repression by signs, and the repression of signs by themselves. This is why there is a radical difference between the symbolic ritual and the signs of fashion. So yeah, I mean, you know, this is where I feel like we're kind of entering the crescendo, the upsurge of Baudrillard's arc that he's taken us in this book. You know, I mean, in the first chapter at the end of it, he kind of said like, my sort of immediate spontaneous death is like the threat to the system that can shake it.
Yeah.
And now it's this squandering of the functional, the squandering of utility or against utility, that I suppose he's going to follow that logic, and which is why fashion is a necessary detour as the model for the instability of all signs. It's a question, right? It's a question of it's almost beyond affirmative or negative in terms of fashion, right? It's this is the question where it's like, is Baudrillard merely simulating a nostalgia for this fantasied origin of where signs had stability, and you know, where deterritorialization was limited?
Yeah.
Is that only simulated? I mean, is that, you know, like, it's hard to say, which is why that paradox that I brought up earlier, right? It's ethnocentric to sort of whitewash primitive cultures, but it's somehow okay to like throw modern culture in relief and in negativity, right? I mean, like, I guess that's the thing. Like, is the functional squandering Baudrillard's like positive moment?
Yeah.
I mean, is this a kind of latent or even patent anarchism?
Well, I wonder how this would be, what he would think about something like fast fashion, and I don't know if that's a concept. Is that a concept you're familiar with? Are you familiar with the concept of fast fashion or fast fashion retailers? It's oftentimes, you know, it's brands like Zara, brands like H&M, Forever 21,
Okay.
where it's all predicated on being actually, it's funny, it's they're simulations, they're knockoffs of real trendy couture style garments.
Gotcha.
But the construction and the materials, etc., are done in a way so that one can purchase this trendy item with the expectation that this garment is only going to last for a season. So there's that's why they call it sort of fast fashion. It's kind of, you can incorporate these trends that are hot in the fashion world at a lower price. And then the kind of expectation is there's a throwaway element to it.
Yeah. I mean,
the construction, the materials, all that, it's not intended to last, but you can still participate in this, having this knockoff version of a more expensive garment or style.
Yeah. I think that exemplifies exactly what Baudrillard's talking about. That's the taking the logic he sees in fashion to the extreme. Yeah. I think that's great. I think that's a nice.
Is that sort of doing what he's, I mean, is that not doing what he's talking about? But I don't think there doesn't seem to be any revolutionary. It's
that next level, right? Where you're participating in a certain trend by proxy, right? You're trying to pass,
right,
as participating in the latest trends, but without the. It's almost, it's kind of interesting. I see this a lot with handbags. You see this a lot because they can be fucking expensive if they are legit.
Right.
But many of them pass. Many of them are my wife's favorite bags. Used to be. They were knockoffs of like $1,000 purses.
Right.
She likes those more because Like she has one really nice legit purse, and that's like you break that out and you're like, all right, this is some serious shit. I'm gonna be a badass bitch today. But she doesn't use that every day, right? There's something interesting about that with the knockoff bags where it is actually, it's passing off as the haute couture shit, but it's actually for functional utility, because if that bag gets ruined or gets used and beat up, it doesn't matter. So there's actually this counter tendency, right, of reintroducing functionality, as you said, because you can throw it away. Yeah. You can waste it, but kind of functionally, the functional utility is the conspicuous consumption.
Right. Yes. Exactly.
And it's obviously related to a kind of classism, right?
Take on the signs of wealth or whatever. Presumably, this still all goes back to all political economy being libidinal element, right? Of, I guess, in the Lacanian sphere, with trying to attract, thinking that this is what the other desires. The other wants me to look like this, so I'm going to buy it. Like, I'll do this. It's
what Zizek talks about with the feminine. The masculine position wants to be the phallus, but the feminine wears the phallus, right? It straps it on. I mean, and when my wife gets, it's usually other women, but they're like, oh my God, that's such a beautiful bag. She's not like embarrassed or trying to lie to them. Right. She's like, oh, this is a fucking knockoff. Like it's almost like being proud of it and being like, yeah, you can have this too. So in that sense, it's not necessarily, there's not necessarily like embarrassment that there's almost like a little bit of joy that like, hey, yeah, I can get away with this.
Right.
So
what do you think about that aspect about the model becoming the only system of reference? You touched on that a little bit before. Did you have anything?
I just think that his way of using model here is tied up with the way he's using code. And I'm still a little bit murky about the conceptualization, because with someone like Deleuze, when he's looking at Plato, in Plato, the model itself is the form. And Will said it well when we were talking a few weeks ago, where it's this level of participation, and Plato is trying to figure out which claimants are participating by rank, and the idea is first and foremost that which participates primarily of itself, in and of itself. With Deleuze, he sees that, like with the allegory of the cave and shit like that, it's this question of an ideal model, an ideal form, idea, whatever, and everything else is copies of it, which is why painting is very low on Plato's scale, because it's supposedly a reproduction or representation of an actual thing, which itself is already copying the ideal thing. So it's like twice removed in terms of participating in the real.
Interesting. Thinking about that in the context of the fast fashion too is sort of interesting.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, and so with Deleuze, what he tries to do is say, it's what needs to occur, or what he tries to claim occurs with the overturning of Platonism is overturning the whole copy model system itself. And this is the play of, this is the sort of mad, wild becomings of simulacra that Plato tried to ward off. It's like Medusa, the philosopher and the sophist. The only difference between them is that the philosopher stakes a claim on truth, whereas the sophist does away with that, or doesn't wager upon that, or in fact wages war upon those claims. If you take Plato's side, the only thing standing between, sort of truth and barbarism is the philosopher, right? He's like the heroic type, and Deleuze wants to kind of do away with that. So with Baudrillard, though, here talking about the model, I don't think he's necessarily, again, it's not speaking the same language or using the same word, but I don't think he's really, he's not. He could easily be doing this overturning of Platonism. And in fact, he's maybe doing it by proxy, inadvertently, but he's not necessarily concerned with this question of this Nietzschean question of how the true world finally became a fable. I think he's working through a different set of signifiers, right? Whatever you want to call them. And here model, I think it's hard to say. I mean, like when he talks about sexuality and the mannequin, right? For example, I see that as a kind of question of models. I think what he's trying to articulate is something that Guattari got into in his late in his life, which is this question of meta-modelization, right? And what Simondon would say, there is molding, right? Like molding a brick. There is modulation, which is kind of the other extreme, where it's something is infinitely moldable. And so never ever molded. And then in between is modeling, right? You know, you can think about the difference between a clay that's meant to be fired in a kiln and made into a brick versus a kind of modeling clay that has more plasticity, right? And is suited, it has different colloidal properties, right? Is more suitable to that kind of sculpting. I think that may be closer to what Baudrillard is talking about with models, but this is one of the tricky things with Baudrillard, right? I mean, he's not necessarily going to hold our hand and define things, right? He's not going to sit down and always say like, here's the definition, right? He sets these terms out like the code. I feel like sometimes when he talks about the code and the terrorism of the code, I feel like he kind of parodies himself, because I don't know what I don't always. The word code is a code word for him. It's just like, it's supposed to be this kind of catch-all. But again, that's part of but your first question about my frustration with Baudrillard.
Thought that was kind of interesting to like think about this in the way that due to the cyclical nature of fashion and how these prior fashions are kind of updated throughout the years over and over again and reiterated upon. So in that sense, it's kind of like you're saying relative to Plato, the painting being a simulation of an already simulated thing. So the fast fashion is a simulation of an already simulated thing as well.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Because due to the cyclical repetition even within the haute couture world or whatever, right? That's already referencing a prior in addition to.
I guess that's interesting. I mean, it's helpful, I think, to talk about perhaps Baudrillard's levels of simulation.
The procession, yeah.
It's like the difference he makes between hot money and cool money, right? You know, that this next level removed of simulation is kind of the hot, would you call it hot fashion?
Fast fashion.
Fast fashion. Well, in Baudrillard's terms, it might be like cool fashion, right? In the sense in which it's floating versus the tectonic drift of fashion, right? It's because it's that secondary move.
Now, I don't remember if he does this here or not, but certainly later, at least by the time he's doing simulation and simulacra, it's about the copy of the real, or the copy of the copy that's more original than the real, or something like that, or that's more authentic than the original. The copy that's more authentic than the original. Yeah, which goes back to the whole Borges and the map territory,
right?
That we discussed previously.
And that's how he starts simulation and simulacra, correct?
Yes.
By talking about the map and the territory.
Right. The map exceeding the territory.
And Lyotard references it in Libidinal Economy. You know, I'm sure there are great books on Borges and modern philosophy, because, you know, it's seemingly, especially for these French guys that we like, you know, Borges is so important.
I think it's interesting here that he says, hence the fate of the economics begins to emerge in the form of fashion, which is further down the route of general commutations than money and the economy.
Well, he predicted that shit pretty well. If anything one can say about Baudrillard, you can't say that he didn't
understand how the world works, man.
Or have some foresight into certain things.
Right.
Just because he talked about the Twin Towers, I'm not going to say that like he predicted that event. But like here with the question of money, I mean, in 76, I mean, was France still on a kind of gold standard? If I remember correctly, it was like in the 80s for America, but I could be totally wrong.
No, it was 70s for America.
France, Italy left the gold standard in 36.
Now, see, it was modified though, because like in the US, you had the gold bugs and the silver rights or whatever the fuck controversy, right? Because they it was fully severed, at least in the States. Nixon did.
Okay.
Yeah, Nixon announced in 71 the US would no longer convert dollars to gold. So the standard was abandoned in a certain sense in the 30s, but by this point, it was like completely severed.
I guess what Baudrillard is saying here about the fact that fashion already exemplifies this move outside a system of reference. Fashion already exemplifies the logic of the lack of reference, right, in terms of signs.
What's kind of interesting here, the connection you can draw between the cyclical nature of fashion and capitalism is the cyclical nature of both, which I think is sort of interesting and definitely has ramifications. There's a certain, I don't know, there's a synthesis here of some type operating.
Right.
I also think what's, kind of an interesting line of flight you can take to tie this to our contemporary world is how sort of relative to entrepreneurship or startup culture or the whole world of angel investing and that sort of thing.
Yeah, right. Crowdfunding, stuff like that.
Are you familiar with Elizabeth Holmes and the company Theranos?
Oh yeah. We've watched the documentary.
Gotcha.
She and Zuckerberg would be a great pair. They are the most alien in terms of facial affects.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting off topic, but go on. What was your thought about Elizabeth Holmes?
Well, so
just the fabrication and
the whole fabrication. I mean, that's an extreme case of what I'm sort of talking about.
Yes.
Is how simulation is even it's creeping into the political economy,
right?
In this way, because like there's no, you know what I mean. The floating signs are deceptive, or like, you know what I mean. There's a certain, or I don't know. Maybe that's. I could put perhaps bracket that or something. I don't know.
No, I think that. I think that's good. It's also what I was talking to you a little bit about with catfishing, right?
Yes, exactly.
The show Catfish,
right? Precisely.
This notion of simulating, and that's kind of what the internet allows in a certain way is the ability, the instantaneous ability or semi-instantaneous ability to become whatever we want.
Right. And
to perform identities in ways that aren't tied down to our facticity or whatever, that kind of performance is somewhat liberating, even if it can eventually lead to hurting other people, manipulating stuff. But I think with someone like Lyotard, what's interesting about Lyotard is that he shows that if capitalism is in crisis, if that's its cyclical nature, Nietzsche shows that decadence, or that values are in decadence, and for Lyotard, it's about accelerating decadence. This is part of his evil period, so he may have disavowed this later, but this question of the decadence of values, I think, is kind of tied here to what Baudrillard is trying to articulate in terms of fashion, except that in a certain sense, fashion is more cynical and nihilistic than even decadence itself, because to a certain extent, for Lyotard at least, the acceleration of decadence is, if it's cyclical in the sense of Nietzschean eternal return, then it's kind of, I think, closer to Deleuze's notion of eternal return, which is sort of breaking the perfect circle, right? It's the fact that values are selected out. The extremes are the ones that return. right? I mean, if difference is said to return, it is like the same, but
I think
different.
that kind of, yeah.
It's fucking galaxy brain shit. I know. I didn't articulate that well.
I think there kind of may be a tie to the way that, I was talking about how the trends in fashion, like even if it's riffing on an earlier period of something, right? So I'm trying to think, are you familiar with what broguing is on shoes? It's typically dress shoes or boots that have broguing. You know what it is. You just don't know. It's called broguing. All these little holes, etc. In particular, the way that this is done, this shoe, we're looking at an Allen Edmonds, like not a loafer, it's an Oxford shoe, standard dress shoe, laced up dress shoe. Now it has the broguing, which is typically a wingtip. You see that. Now, the reason this style originally evolved, it had a function relative to England and in the countryside and bogs. So the holes in the shoes or the broguing would allow water to drain out.
Ah, that makes sense.
So at one time it has this meaning, and now it was originally just this kind of country thing that became, now it's kind of a status symbol of broguing on shoes is like looks fancy.
This is a perfect example of how fashion can.
The broguing is the example of the extreme that is repeated or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And the functionality ceased to be tied to it.
Correct,
right?
yes.
The referential basis.
Correct. Yes.
Is gone. What we're left with is the aesthetic veneer.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great example.
Now that ties into Theranos in the sense, and now that's an extreme example because the whole business, not even the business model, but the product that they wanted to offer ended up being fake, right? Like they kind of fake.
Yes.
I guess that's the premise, right? For those that don't know, with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, is that it was this kind of drug. I guess that's kind of irrelevant, but basically it's all that it didn't work. The product never worked.
I mean, the idea was with one drop of blood, you can run all of these tests, right? Yeah. For diseases, for afflictions, and the concept far outstripped the reality. They were selling the concept before they really had the technology.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that same logic is happening. It's happening in fashion first. Now it is actually getting into the political economy. Obviously, that's an extreme example. Another example that's not quite the same, but is still getting to it in the sense of like Lyft and Uber that were never profitable. They did offer an actual service. So, right.
Oh, yeah.
They offer an actual service, but it's not profitable. And they can continue to be funded and so forth, right? But ultimately, the business model is bullshit. It doesn't work at the end of the day, but they can keep on attracting investors and kind of like keeping the simulation going with injections of the real. And I'm being metaphorical there, obviously. But yeah, it's kind of like the same thing. Like it keeps this whole fake thing going because there's the potential, if they can figure out profitability, then, obviously the reward is quite high. But It doesn't look like that's going to ever be the case. Even its own sort of form of potlatch relative to these angel investors that are dumping in billions and billions and subsidizing all these rides, etc. So it's a different form of simulation. It's not as intense as like the Elizabeth Holmes example, but you see what I'm saying, right? And this model is being repeated, just like the early .com bubble, right? You could have books.com or something and make like pets.com, right? Like, you know what I mean? It's kind of this Wild West element where nobody knows the values of this shit. So people will give you money just for like for the potential of a huge payoff. So even companies and whole business models and all of that are being sort of simulated effectively now. And I'm wondering if that's sort of what he was getting at. This part also reminded me of redundancies of resonance for Guattari.
Yeah.
Because he talks about the light and the heavy signs, the light signs being something like fashion and the heavy signs being something like political economy. So something like fashion is always going to be out ahead of the heavier signs, political economy. But as you can see in my example with these companies, it is catching up to fashion. It's following the lead of fashion. So I guess there you would say, political economy has a higher resonance of redundancy.
Yeah.
Or am I being cringe?
It's
trying to shoehorn this.
The redundancies of resonance versus redundancies of interaction for Guattari. Yeah. I think you're right. There's something about, I think that what Baudrillard is interested in is the fact that I think with his cynicism, he sees fashion as you said, the light signs, and they're able to commutate right through the code and all of this in ways in which are highly exemplified by redundancies of resonance, which for Guattari usually refers to linguistic sign systems. I think where Guattari is interesting and perhaps more affirmative and less cynical is the fact that, he sees beyond that and beneath it. What he's interested in with schizoanalysis, particularly in its second phase, is redundancies of interaction. And that's kind of where the machinic aspect comes in. That's where the diagrammatic aspect comes in. And I don't think Baudrillard is as hopeful as all that.
Right. Yeah, definitely not. And I do think that, I guess we should say that Guattari is very critical of the postmodernists. And I think Baudrillard probably being the sort of king, of the postmodernist, that, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So he's lumped in as a post-structuralist, which he is, right? He's not a structuralist, but I think he would be the most, if you think of postmodern, he would be a postmodern theorist.
He's theorizing postmodernity.
Right. In a way that Deleuze and Guattari are not. Well,
I guess that's the thing.
It seems that Guattari wouldn't embrace that label of post, you know what I mean? I think he seems to be taking an antagonistic, critical approach to, I feel like it's three ecologies maybe that he specifically calls out postmoderns.
Yeah, and it's hard to say if Baudrillard's lumped in with that or not. We've talked a little bit about Baudrillard antagonizing his contemporaries,
right?
Like Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari. One of the aspect of post-structuralism is, a reinterrogation of Marx, but also a reinterrogation of the unconscious. This is how this book ends purportedly, is with this, what's the section called? I glanced at it the other day. Beyond the unconscious. The main point of that last paragraph itself is this reevaluation of Marxism and psychoanalysis. I think if anything ties together Anti-Oedipus, libidinal economy, and symbolic exchange and death, it is that crucial reexamination of Marxism and psychoanalysis. I think without that thread, you don't have, whether you call it postmodern philosophy or post-structuralism, I don't think you have that. And part of that legacy is definitely this grappling with someone like Saussure and Lévi-Strauss, right? With structural anthropology on one side and structural linguistics on the other. I don't think the 20th century looks the same without how deeply, especially in France, those two thinkers, and obviously Lacan and Nietzsche and his structuralism. Yes, for Anti-Oedipus, Nietzsche is the crux. And I think for Baudrillard, he's looking more at traditional sociologists like Mauss.
Durkheim, yeah.
Yeah, I think that calling Baudrillard a philosopher to core kind of hides the fact that his tradition and who he's drawing from. Just think, we talked about his doctrinal, his dissertation committee, right?
Yeah.
Lefebvre, Barthes, and Bourdieu. That line of flight that he's on, I think, is different.
Yes.
From someone like either Deleuze or Guattari, right? Either the history of philosophy or the history of analysis, which is why when he says psychoanalysis is sort of determines the unconscious in these trends and fashions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an extremely cynical take that Guattari would vehemently disregard.
Yeah.
Because, the way he starts off the machinic unconscious is this fact that with this new line of Lacanians, of which he is obviously a black sheep and an inheritor, the unconscious is treated like a mathematical language with this ideal of information transmission, right? That the matheme and the axiom combine. And for Guattari, he sees the Lacanians as even more distasteful than the Freudians and the Jungians and the Reichians with their mythology, so to speak. So I don't think, I mean, for Guattari, you know, it's, he kind of continues Freud's legacy of, he continues Lacan's legacy of a return to Freud. I mean, like he himself says that in Three Ecologies, this question of renovating Freudism, that Freud's discovery, there is something to it. I don't think Baudrillard really has much, you know, with analysis. I don't think that he thinks about it as Guattari does, which is that the analytic machine and the revolutionary machine have to collaborate with the artistic machine, you know. And you know, I was kind of thinking about this reading Baudrillard, where when in Anti-Oedipus they reject the model of the unconscious as a theater, right, and propose a factory. And I think that what is perhaps not articulated overtly enough is the fact that they're not rejecting theater as an art form, because what they reject is Freud's classical theater with its representationalism versus, say, like Artaud's theater, or they say, like, even during Freud's time, he could have leaned on the avant-garde theater with like Wedekind or maybe early Brecht. I have to look, but you know, but he's relying on Sophocles, right, and Goethe, and it's the Hamletian Oedipal theater that they reject, not the kind of avant-garde theater where I think meaning is less important, right? So I guess that's the same thing with Baudrillard is like this question of, I don't know. I mean, like when he talks about the unmooring of the signifier from the signified, and he talks about like the meaninglessness of fashion. As I said earlier, I know he rejects a certain nostalgia, but it still seems like he's simulating a kind of nostalgia. Yeah. And I'm not sure. I haven't finished the book yet, so I am very like anticipatory to see. You know, I mean, fuck it. Like if we're gonna finish the book, I want to see Baudrillard get darker. I want to see him. I want to see him be more cynical, more. Bring it on. Come on.
With the final chapter on death. Well,
the fifth chapter is on death.
Okay, so the fifth chapter is the one where gets pretty dark, I think.
And then there's the extermination of the name of God, which, you know, that sounds juicy. I'm looking forward to that.
As a rejoinder to my name of God's the first thing that gets simulated.
Yeah. Well, like here in this, what's this quote? You mean to read it, or do you want to read it? Where does it start?
In fashion, as in the code, signifieds come unthreaded, and the parades of the signifier no longer lead anywhere. The signified distinction is erased, as in sexual difference, where gender becomes so many distinctive oppositions and something like an immense fetishism bound up with an intense pleasure and an exceptional desolation takes hold, a pure and fascinating manipulation coupled with the despair of radical indeterminacy. Fundamentally, fashion imposes on us the rupture of an imaginary order, that of a referential reason in all its guises, and if we are able to enjoy the dismantling or stripping of reason, enjoy the liquidation of meaning, particularly at the level of our body, hence the affinity of clothing and fashion, enjoy this endless finality of fashion, we also suffer profoundly from the corruption of rationality it implies, as reason crumbles under the blow of the pure and simple alternation of signs. Now, see, to me, it's this last line that's the most important here. Reason crumbling under the blow of pure and simple alternation of signs, because I think you see this principle operating particularly relative to political economy in the United States as the really good example of how this shit works. Because it's all about these floating signs of the Republicans accuse Biden of being a communist or a socialist. The Democrats accuse the Republicans of being fascists or Nazis. And it all stays at this level of simulation, of a simulated political economy, where any kind of reasoning or anything like that becomes kind of whatever, because there's no referent. So then it becomes about the signs of whatever. So I'm on this team, so I'm against vaccines, or I'm on this team, so I'm against ivermectin or whatever, as an example, but without really interrogating the reason. It's not about reason. It's about signs. It's about this surface level equivalency of all signs, and there not being any kind of referent to draw to. There can be a certain level of indeterminacy in anything. And as indeterminacy proliferates, entropy proliferates, I think. And I think that's not what he's getting at, is the more signs proliferate, the higher entropy increases, then systems break down and crumble. Effectively is kind of what he's maybe getting at.
I say go further into indeterminacy.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's
you know, and I think that what he leaves out here, though, he intimates it when he says that power hates fashion, because fashion calls into question all signs, including power's own. And I think that what he could add is that with the acceleration of this process of indeterminacy simulation, whatever the fuck you want to call it, is something that Guattari is very sensitive to. For example, he's not the only one, but it's an example, which is there is a concomitant. I said the fucking word. There is there's a contemporaneous backlash, and a rise in fundamentalisms of all kinds. To reestablish territoriality and referentiality, right?
Yes. And that's very well tying into this too. Yeah.
Including, but not limited to, things like gender, which we see is one of the cultural touchstones. Yeah. You know, we could talk about the progress we've made considering in our lifetimes, which is immense, but you do see a huge backlash. You know, we can say it's reactionary, conservative, but it's not only limited to Republican, Democrat. It's this question of, you know, when he talks about, I'm not sure who he quotes, but Judy, who writes about the signifier is hermaphroditic, which sounds like a pretty fucking cool essay to quote from. But when he talks about like gender becomes so many distinctive oppositions, something like an immense blah, 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 even that's kind of breaking down. On the one hand, that's kind of fought against, but on the other hand, you have like TERFs. You still have the reactionary position, which intensifies at the same time, or sometimes at the same pace, sometimes outstripping it, where the gender is that which has to be implanted on the body. It has to signify, you know. And specifically, I mean, Guattari relates this is part of the reterritorializing effect of faciality, right? The face is supposed to, in the capitalistic machine, it's supposed to like answer these binaries, yes, no, man, woman, old, young, you know, all these different binaries. And I think that like you see this backlash and this demand for, well, like to wear the phallus, right? Instead of wearing the phallus, it's like the phallus has to be displayed at all times.
Yeah.
Whereas for Lacan, right, it's the asymmetrical lack that Deleuze and Guattari, you know, talk about, right? Nobody has the phallus, but that's precisely the demand to show and to answer definitively, yes, no, man, woman, that kind of shit. This is why I say like more indeterminacy, right? Because that indeterminacy is precisely a threat to a certain type of power. It doesn't have to be the power of the state, right? It's a majoritarian power which demands for clear-cut answers. And I think that that's part of Baudrillard's merit, is to coolly and objectively kind of say like, yeah, I mean, shit is, you know, values are literally floating over an abyss. We still haven't gotten into a point, and we've only gotten hints of what needs to happen to resurrect the symbolic that fashion, for example, and this flotation of signs undercuts. So how do we bring back the symbolic regime? And this is why the one positive statement I could come up with was, what was it? The squandering of the functional. Doesn't he say something like that?
Yeah.
The functional squandering to bring about a symbolic destruction. Obviously, you know, you could bring up someone like Bataille and his question of the accursed share, his question of waste, expenditure without utility. I think that's obviously like a partner that has to be read with Baudrillard, right? I mean, like does he quote Bataille in the first chapter? He'll bring him up in Political Economy and Death. He'll bring up Bataille. So we have that to look forward to.
He's mentioned in the intro.
Right. Okay. That's must be what I'm thinking of.
In chapter 4, and then quite a bit in the rest of the book, it seems, particularly in chapter 5 and 6. Now, a couple of things. One would be that there's a quote here, or there's a passage Baudrillard says, the Native American or the indigenous person, their whole body is the face. Do you recall that?
I marked that Guattari wouldn't have any of that shit.
Interesting.
In the faciality plateau and in Guattari, I think he's specifically like quoting Clasters. Guattari's main thing is that the face is like a deterritorialized head, and that in primitive societies, there was a polyvocality of the body that didn't require the face. So I think that Guattari would actually say the inverse of Baudrillard here. Basically, Guattari's point is that some systems, some regimes of science don't require a face.
Interesting. I want to read this quote just because I think it's kind of interesting and to contextualize a bit. Another game is set up the opposition of dress and body, designation and censure, the same fractures between the signifier and signified, the same play of displacement and allusion. Fashion, strictly speaking, begins with this partition of the body, repressed and signified in an elusive way. It puts an end to all in the simulation of nudity, and nudity as the model of the simulation of the body. For the Indian, the whole body is a face, that is a promise and a symbolic act, as opposed to nudity, which is only sexual instrumentality.
I don't know what the fuck that means.
Right? Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess focusing on this distinction between dress and fashion, perhaps. I don't know how to quite articulate that difference fully, but dress has, and this is where the primitive versus or like contemporary too becomes an issue, perhaps.
Oh yeah,
because dress, one would assume, would be in the quote unquote, would be associated or connotes quote unquote primitive, versus body, or not body, but
fashion.
Fashion is a modern thing, which is sort of true. Although, is it though? I'm trying to think of how Potlat functions relative to the body, because he does say that there is a certain element at play relative to fashion and festival.
Yeah.
In this excess, because of that indeterminacy, because of the waste of it, because it's a sort of tautological thing, fashion. So in that sense, extending the face to the body, or the whole face or the whole body acting as the face, kind of does make sense in that model. If you're trying to if you're thinking about this in the context of natural, in air quotes or whatever, or scare quotes.
I also don't agree with this thing about nudity is sexual instrumentality. You see in many cultures the lack thereof of dress itself as part of the mode, right? Part of the fashion. Just think of National Geographic when you were a kid and sneaking a peek at, at the breasts of whether it be, South American natives or Aboriginal natives or even certain African tribes. And the body isn't covered like it is, say, with burqas or so. That question of nudity in those cultures would not be sexual instrumentality. That's just the mode.
Yeah.
That's just us. That's just a standard. I mean, and part of that too is about even just the question of the climate, right? And the weather, the sort of mild climate where it's nice and sunny all the fucking time. Right. I mean, it's just that kind of statement. This is where sometimes I feel like Baudrillard is kind of like the classic shit poster, because it's like you can get on Twitter and just like people can just say whatever the fuck they want. And sometimes I feel like Baudrillard he can't keep, how does he keep getting away with this shit? Right. he keeps just like throwing shit out there. I mean, it works within the way in which he's elaborating this logic. I'm just not sure if I agree with a statement like that. In the end, it's like not everything stands or falls on that one statement.
I mean, you're in agreement with the distinction between dress and fashion, or no?
Oh, yes. I was just going to say, Guattari kind of talks about the face as dressing up subjective black holes.
Right. Okay.
Right. And specifically the capitalist face, as I said, with its binary requirements.
Maybe this next little section, this kind of goes further into this whole discussion of the body and sexuality. The new reality of the body is hidden sex is from the outset merged with the woman's body. The concealed body is feminine, not biologically, of course, rather mythologically. The conjunction of fashion and woman since the bourgeois Puritan era reveals that a double indexation, that of fashion on a hidden body, that of a woman on a repressed sex. This conjunction did not exist, or not so much, until the 18th century, and not at all, of course, in ceremonial societies. And for us today, it is beginning to disappear. As for us, when the destiny of a hidden sex and the forbidden truth of the body arises, when fashion itself neutralizes the opposition between the body and dress, then the affinity of woman and fashion progressively diminishes. Fashion is generalized and becomes less and less the exclusive property of one sex or of one age. Be wary, for it is a matter neither of progress nor of liberation.
I mean, the one thing that I can say is, like, with dress specifically, you know, you see that the obvious majority of designers are almost exclusively making outfits for women. But you are seeing this less and less. I mean, the dominance is still there, obviously, but you are seeing more. You can just look at current runway shows, right? You are seeing more. I'm talking about high fashion, I guess, right?
Yeah. Androgyny,
you know,
the proliferation of androgyny.
Right. You see this even in cultural studies. Like, it's very rare, like in like gender studies or whatever. There's tons of books on the female body and the male gaze, etc. But there are only a few works on the male body. I think that's the title of the book, The Male Body. It's I think it's by Susan Bordeaux. I'm trying to remember, but it's interesting, right? Because, you know, the stereotype is obviously that men aren't supposed to like necessarily concern themselves with fashion. He even cites the example of the dandy, right? Which proves the point by way of exception. And you're going to read a quote?
It made me think of this quote from Rick Owens that was saying, working out is modern couture. No outfit is going to make you look or feel as good as having a fit body. Buy less clothing and go to the gym instead.
Chad shit.
Body fascism. An interesting counterpoint relative to, I guess, the discussion of the male and female body as it pertains to sexuality and fashion and androgyny, which I think is interesting because, like, I sort of am like the androgynous. I wear skirts and shit.
Yeah.
And shit like that, or things that mimic a dress or whatever. It doesn't appeal to me.
The importation of the kilt, right? But yeah, I go back to this quote. Let's look at it again, the end of it particularly. Stereotypically, men are not supposed to like care about fashion, right? You know, they're supposed to roll out of bed and put on some jeans and a shirt and not really give a shit about that. But I think that's an outdated stereotype already, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you've already said that you have an eye for it and a mind for it. I like my silly little t-shirts. Shout out to Crit Trip, for example. They make good, they make good shit. You know, so even the notion that men aren't supposed to care about fashion is one way of being fashionable, right?
Yes.
You know,
that's good call.
And I mean, you think of like a woman stripper at a bachelor party wearing a bikini or blah, blah, blah. But like with again, stereotypically with male strippers, what they come dressed as a cop or a fireman or some shit. So there's something here that if Baudrillard wanted this chapter to be a little bit longer about the question of outfits, there's still notions of like uniforms that are an extreme counterexample to fashion. Even if, you know, you can have differences in like the police uniform or the fire uniform, there's still a sense in which it's very recognizable and has a kind of stability. Perhaps it's the counterexample of the heavy signs in fashion, right? That it's sort of somehow apart from or out of fashion, even though it's bound up with dress. And I guess part of it is because it's supposed to be immediately designatable and signifiable, right? It's supposed to read immediately, like the uniform.
I just actually had this thought about how the head coverings for Muslim women, I forget what's just the head covering. Hijab is a headscarf.
So not the hijab, the hijab. Speaking as a Southern white boy. Is that what you were thinking of?
Yeah, so more like the hijab, which is just the head scarf covering. Doesn't cover doesn't obscure the actual face, just the hair and so forth.
Right.
Now you'll see some women that will wear a Louis Vuitton or some other, maybe a Gucci print headscarf.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But the rest of their outfit will be, you know, relatively traditional, in scare quotes. But the head covering will be like denoting a couture or hot couture or something.
Right. That's the show. That's the showpiece, right?
Right.
That's oh, wow. There's like a billion different.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. But this even brings up an interesting question of, is this dress or fashion relative to the burqa, the niqab, the hijab, etc.? Like, where do these fall?
That's where we could say that Baudrillard's own, in many of his books, because of his sociological background and his critique of ethnography and these other things, like we see in Simulacra and Simulation, you could say that that's the ever-present danger of like a creeping ethnocentrism that everybody kind of has to deal with.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, that's all I'm going to say about it. I'm not, because it's not necessarily his place as a white French man to talk about all cultures as though they were like universally tappable. You just tap into wherever you want. That has its own ethnocentric problems. But yeah, you're right. I mean, like the functionality is bound up with certain repressive forms of patriarchy, right? That in the West is just a more subliminal form. It's not so overt.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, even like quotes from, I forget who it was. I don't know if it was an imam or if it was a politician, where it was basically he was talking about how all men should have beards precisely due to the fact that beardless men are androgynous and therefore can potentially like corrupt heterosexual morals, right? That beardless men are, and the Greeks thought this too. I mean, like, you know, old Plato is a kind of counterexample of this, but even the Athenians, you know, their understanding, and Foucault goes into this very well with their notion of active male sexuality versus passive. And two adult men together would have been considered immoral for Athenians. But the young boy needing the mentor, right? The teenage boy before he gets a beard, right? But he's already pubescent or whatever. That's okay, right? Because as a boy, you're able to be in that passive relationship. I forget who it is, maybe Martha Nussbaum, who talks about Plato. He tried to convince the king, the tyrant, whatever, of Syracuse. He tried to convince him to adopt his philosophy, his philosopher king ideology. And it's theorized that like there in Syracuse, it was morally okay for two men to be openly romantic. And so Plato supposedly gets this more free, liberal outlook towards homosexuality that would have been out of place in Athens. precisely because of their binaries, right? And part of what Baudrillard is thinking through is like any good post-structuralist, right? He's thinking through the instability of binaries, right? I mean, he talks about the terrorism of the code, but he's also talking about at the same time the instability of these fundamental values, right? And I mean, in that sense, you can obviously think. I mean, he uses a word like deconstruction unproblematically. I mean, it's obvious that if he's not directly influenced by Derrida, he's at least thinking through some of these. He's thinking through some of these, these classical Western problems. You know, the whole logocentrism and metaphysics of presence, blah, blah, blah. Right. So that's kind of where I would go. And I'm still thinking through this thing about the body becomes a face because, you know, the veil itself, since we're talking about facial coverings, head coverings, I mean, the veil itself is an ancient form of dress. Right. And so, you know, again, that kind of, I hate to just call him ethnocentric because again, it's not like a question of being like woke or something, but when he says like for the Indian, I don't know what he means. Like, he's like bringing that out of left field. Even that term is kind of problematic, but you know, that's
right. Yeah, exactly.
Any like final thoughts?
Well, there's a bit about, so he talks about art as well. And so that was one thing just to kind of briefly mention is what is interesting. You can see in his critique of modernity and how it is flattening everything out into this general equivalency. And he uses a great example of the art museum, because the art museum will have, its virtue is that it has all styles. Nothing is necessarily segregated outside of perhaps low art, right? But in terms of within the sphere of what is considered art, you know, high art, etc., right? The museum places everything side by side.
Right.
So that's kind of this great way of an example of how that flattening out occurs in the way that the art is displayed side by side. Now, to build off of that is something like the concept, or just to at least mention the concept of the NFT, which takes this whole notion of art even in simulation even further to like a deeper, more like alienated form outside of even just art. It's a simulation of a simulation of a simulation, right?
Yeah.
If we're picking it with Plato, right? So there's like an original whatever form that's being bastardized. Firstly with the painting, and then now the painting is being simulated digitally, virtually. So it's even further down the line abstraction. Right.
And ownership itself becomes a kind of free floating.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good read on it for sure.
I'm just building off of what you're saying with the NFT. Yeah, I mean, ownership itself is a kind of virtual token.
Yes.
Or you kind of have like a certificate of ownership, but that's it, right?
Right. That's a great thing to kind of think about. Yeah, I like where you're going there as far as the ownership aspect, because what are you owning?
Right.
The certificate that says, you know what I mean? I don't know. That's just brings all these things kind of into a sharp relief as far as floating signs and whatnot, virtualization.
To a certain extent, it is kind of also a retro effect, sort of resurrecting forms of patronage, right? We have a Patreon. That's kind of, you know, the ownership for like.
This is why the
like
Neo.
Patron, yeah.
This is why the Neo. That's a great example of where the Neo and the retro.
Yeah.
Aligning in the or they're like both existing side by side within the modern rather.
Yes.
So I definitely wanted to mention that just briefly, and again to tap into that as well. Like I think that movie F for Fake from Orson Welles has a lot of resonance there because of it's a fake documentary about a fake art forger that is sort of playing with the same questions about, you know, there within the film. One of the biggest points is that, and he makes this, I brought this up too, relative to the way that pollsters sort of creating their own feedback loops relative to public opinion.
Right.
And so that same relationship occurring in the art market, where museum directors and art dealers are the ones that are sort of creating the market, and they will sort of project qualities into the piece, even if like they could say, like in the film, that's kind of one of the things where they take this art piece and they know that it's a fake, and they take it to a gallery director, and he's like, oh, you can see this is a trademark of this you can see the way that this line is done. This is a trademark of so-and-so style. He takes it to another museum director and they pick up on some other say. So these experts, quote unquote, are adding the legitimacy to the work of art and kind of reproducing this whole whatever miasma of the art market.
Mm-hmm.
You have a similar functionality, and Baudrillard discusses this within this chapter, of all of the people surrounding the fashion industry, right? You have the magazines, you have the reporters, right? You have all that kind of keeps the thing going, the industry itself.
And Baudrillard himself has an essay for critique of the political economy of the sign. It's called The Art Auction, Sign Exchange and Sumptuary Value. So that could be for further reading.
Also the conspiracy of art.
That's one of his books, right?
Mm-hmm. Which I think will go, like, it picks up on a lot of these themes a little bit and runs with them a bit further. But I don't know, I think that kind of wrapped up everything that we kind of touched on, all the main key highlights of kind of where I wanted to go today.
Well, we are going to continue our discussion of all the thinkers we've been reading by turning to Society Against the State next week.
Pierre Clastres, or is it Calastres as Will said?
No, I think it's like Closter. It's like Sartre, right? You know,
okay, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense.
Fucking French.
This will be the Machine Gun Conscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. See y'all next week.
Rules of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.